So one more thing that we want to render is going to be a sort of utility path that will be more like a mask for our eyes and mouth region. So over in my effects node where we have our sparks that we set up, I'll go ahead and I'll just copy paste all of these nodes over here and I'll paste them over to the right, and I'll get rid of this normal and set attributes. So we really want to go back just to our geometry animated along the curve. Okay, and we want to modify this geometry now, so let's go back here and let's place this time shift below and go to the geometry, and I will drop down a mask by ambient occlusion node and use this node to set up some color information. So I will turn off the lighting for the scene so we can just see the color, and we will create a visualizer for this mask attribute that this node creates. So click this icon over here and we can see this is the ambient occlusion so far. Let's go ahead and I will turn on remap ambient occlusion mask, and I will simply reverse this ramp, and let's make some modifications to this, and I will add another keyframe in between here and just sort of increase the contrast here. So I will select all of these keyframes and set the interpolation to B-spline, just so we ensure that this is nice and smooth. Let's maybe decrease the bias a little bit, and this will hopefully increase the contrast a little bit, and let's go to sampling, and I will set the maximum ray distance to maybe 1. So we expand this effect a little bit. Now we only really need this effect to happen on the eyes and the mouth, so we can actually get rid of this geometry here in the back with the horns. And let's go back to our geometry and to normal lighting, and I will press S and go in a side view, and with my lasso selection tool I can pretty much just grab this entire section over here, and I will just press delete and go back to my perspective. And from here let's also press S again, and I'll grab these horn ends and press delete again. So we kind of isolate just the face now, and we can go to our occlusion now, and let's maybe delete a little bit more of the horns actually. So go back here, go in my side view, press S, and let's try to grab this part with the horns. Okay, and press delete, go back and go back here, turn off the lighting and the grid. Okay, and this should be fine. So I know from my previous experiments that I will need to somehow be able to separate the eyes from the mouth. So I want later in Nuke to be able to grade the mouth and the eyes differently. So we will need to create another attribute that will serve as a mask for this eye region, and we will export that as an image plane. So let's make a little bit of room here, and from this mask by ambient occlusion node I'll drop down a distance along geometry node, and in this node I want to set the start point to be a point that's right in the center of the eyes, so maybe this point, and I will hit enter. And now this computes an attribute that's going to be named distance, that's simply going to indicate the distance from this point along to each point of this geometry. And if I were to create a visualizer for this by hitting this icon, we can see it over here. Let's go ahead and maybe drop down an attribute remap, and here I will place this new attribute that we created, so dist, and I will reverse the output min and max from 0 to 1 to 1 and 0. And now we can also adjust this ramp, and we want to, like we said, isolate this area along the eyes. So something like this, and we can see that we have a problem here with our this attribute on this jaw part, and it's setting the value for this jaw at a default of 1 because the geometry isn't connected to our original geometry. So we can easily fix this if we make some room, and I can simply drop down an attribute wrangle, and in this wrangle I will select the group to be this entire jaw. So just double click any of the points here to select the entire jaw and press enter, and I can simply say that dist equals 0. So back to my attribute remap node, we can adjust this until we get exactly the area that we are interested in. So now this will export as an attribute that's called dist. And so this mask by AO node will generate an attribute that's called mask. And we also want to set the CD to be this mask. So I'll drop down another attribute wrangle over here, and I will rename this to adjust dist. And the second one I will name set CD. And all we want to do in this attribute is say that at CD equals at mask, so that mask attribute that we created. And if I turn off the visualizers, now our points have color information that is generated by our mask by ambient occlusion node, and we can render this as 100% emission. So we go back to our copy to points, and from this node we will drop down a null, and we will name this null, let's say, mask. And I will Control C to copy this, go back up, and remove the render flag from this effects, drop down a new geometry node, rename this to mask, step inside, drop down an object merge, and place our mask here. So we will use this node to render this geometry. Let's go to our material and drop down another principal shader and rename this to mask. And let's go ahead and grab this, Control C, assign it to our mask. So render material set to mask. And let's maybe go to our camera and choose a frame. So maybe this. Go to our out network view and create a new node for this. So drop down a mantra node, and this will be mask. Let's point to our camera. Go to rendering, set this to physically based rendering, and set the pixel samples to maybe 6 and 6. And go to render view. Let's make sure our mask node is selected and hit render. Okay, so it kind of works. Let's change some of the material settings. So over to our material network, let's select this mask and let's see. We will do the same thing that we did for the particle. So we will set all of these to 0, and we want to use emission intensity of 1 and turn on use point color. So now we are rendering exactly only the point color without any lighting affecting this object. And to export that distance attribute that we created, so the dist attribute, as an image plane, we kind of have to crack this material a little bit. So I will right click this and let's choose allow editing of contents and step inside. And let's maybe stop this for a second. Step inside this principal shader. And you can see that this is a gigantic network, but we are really not interested in any of these nodes. All that has to happen here, and you can place this anywhere in this network, is we have to bind, import our attribute. So drop down a bind. And we want to import that dist attribute that we created. And now this is imported in our material. And all we have to do is simply export this now. So from here I can drop down a bind export. And we can name this however we want, but we will keep the name the same, so I will just say dist. So now over in our mantra node, in the images, we can go to extra planes, and we can add a new extra plane, and we simply have to type in the vex variable the name that we gave our attribute that we exported in the principal shader. So I will say dist, and this will be a flow type. And the channel name you can name to whatever you want, but I'll keep this consistent and I'll just say that this is called dist. So this will be the name of the pass that will appear over in Nuke. So if I were to create a new render now, we have our main beauty pass, and now we also have a dist pass that contains our dist attribute. So we will use this as a mask for the main color to separate the eyes from the mouth, and we will have complete control over both of these. Hopefully this will make a little bit more sense when we head over to Nuke, but for now we set up everything that we needed, and we just have to set our folder here. So I save this as mask.$f.exr, set this to render the entire frame range, and we can hit render to disk, and that's pretty much all we need. So we can now head over to Nuke.